Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Teacher Time. We're coming up on the end of January, and we're so glad that you're joining us here either live or perhaps watching this later. For those who didn't see the first episode, I'm Gary Colletti, Director of Programs here at the Bill of Rights Institute. And Liz, would you mind introducing yourself to everyone?
Sure. I'm Liz Evans. I am the Regional Programs Manager for the Western Region.
Very nice, very nice. Well, once again, these episodes are meant for us to have an opportunity for interaction. Feel free to chat with us. We'll be jumping in and out of the chat box from time to time. You may have submitted some questions ahead of time that we'll get to later on or even throughout. So I just want to say hello to everybody. And Liz, if it's all right with you, I say we get started with our first segment here, the news cycle. A lot going on, of course, as it tends to be in the past 2 weeks, because we last episode was 2 weeks ago. So there's almost too much to talk about. Liz, what's first thing on your mind and around the news these days?
I mean, we inaugurated a new president.
That's right.
And the first female vice president. That's the very first thing on my mind because...
Yeah, absolutely. Only a few days ago, if you're watching this live. That is a really big deal. It was different this year than it was usually. Now you're right. There's not only the who was inaugurated, but how it went. Let's get back more into the who. What do you think the significance beyond the obvious is?
I mean, there's so many things that are significant with this, especially, we have Vice President Harris, who is not only the first woman, but she is the first person of color who is a woman in this spot. And the last person to run for vice president that was female was in the early 80s, Geraldine Ferraro, which, I mean, that in itself is such a big deal that now in my lifetime, which I'm not dating myself, but 2 women have run for this office and now we have one. And that to me is really exciting.
Oh, absolutely. And I was going to say the same thing. I mean, not to throw my age out there, but that was 1984. I mean, I was very conscious of what was going on, and it definitely was. It was significant seeing that at the time. But even more so, I think the message was, why not, right? Like even in 1984, it was why is that such an unusual thing to see? And I like to imagine it won't be so unusual going forward.
I mean, that's the hope. If you even consider how many women just ran in the primary for president. And I know that to kind of talk about our other parts of our YouTube page, Mary Patterson and I did a whole thing on women and the, moving up this ladder. And this year was just so different. And it's really cool for me because I have a daughter. So for her, this is now just kind of a normal part of political life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's great to watch. Very thrilling opportunity. I think if we were teaching about this, it's the kind of history that kind of writes itself in an interesting way. But it's definitely very fresh. So this is certainly not the end of this. I'd like to say in our coming episodes, we'll probably take a look at these early days. Some people refer to the first 100 days. I think we create that because we like round numbers, but it's kind of exciting taking a look at the freshness. Again, I'm almost finding it hard to talk about because it is so new. Like this just happened as we were recording this. So letting that sink in sort of is a running theme. But yeah, right from the get-go. And it is a COVID year, so it did look slightly different. I mean, the inauguration, I think, this year raises the question of, what has to happen versus what has just become customary, right? Like the location has changed over time, even the day and everything has changed over time. But what has to happen is the oath, right? That's there in the Constitution. The time of day of when the prior president no longer is president anymore, very set. But everything else, like who shows up, where it takes, all these other things. It's amazing, what the essential thing has to happen. And looking at that day, the essential things happened.
Yes. And it's so even I was talking with my daughter because she was like, I wonder what George Washington's inauguration was like. And it was like, I mean, we could definitely start to look and see, but I'm sure it didn't look anything like this because it's just gotten bigger and bigger throughout the years. And it's a cool thing to look at what has to happen and then what has just started to happen because of tradition.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, and I think we can keep coming back to that. And that is definitely the core of the what has to happen, having the basis of constitutionality is such a core thing. The fact that you can look up exactly, where in where in the Constitution it has to be. The oath itself is right there in Article 2. It's just
Yes.
It's very, very clear. I love the question about Washington. Again, growing up as a New Yorker, it's just one of the many things around the city that occurred that really is significant. But if we can get a little bit into the somewhat customary, I would say somewhat customary over the past many years is also initially getting things done. And I feel like that's, if we can jump into that pivot, there have been some executive actions. There have already been in the first couple of days, quite a lot happening. What do you think of all that?
It is very interesting because I think I've been kind of comparing and contrasting what's going on with President Biden with a lot of FDR stuff. So after he was elected after Hoover, when we talk about this first 100 days, there's a lot of parallels, and it's a very interesting thing to understand the president's power when it comes to executive orders and how that changes. I think a lot of people think, oh, executive orders, it doesn't really affect me, but there's a lot of things that can. And to be very honest with you, I've had a hard time kind of keeping up with everything that's coming out because it seems to just be all of these different things. And it makes me wonder that when we change political parties, like when the president changes political parties, that office, if this is something that happens. So that's also on my list. Like, I wonder, when Obama became president after George W. Bush, if this happened. I wonder when W. Bush became president after Clinton, if this happened. Like, what does that kind of look like? But there's a lot of executive orders to keep up with.
It is. I confess, I want to, and I try to, both as a, from the educator point of view, but also working here, stay on top. And as of this morning, as I was researching, I think I counted 33, and I'm certain since I turned my computer off and did something else, maybe something else has happened. I wonder if some of that, and we may talk about this in future episodes, is about, there's the gravity of them, but there's also the making public the agenda setting, right? Because a strange thing, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, is having a State of the Union so soon after a new president comes in. It's like, that action's coming up not too far from now. And, in that's quite a lot for somebody who just started. I would have difficulty with that. So I wonder if in some way these actions kind of signal what's important, kind of looking at what that list of things are. Some of them are reversals. A lot of them are not. A lot of them are brand new things that are not reversals. And so I wonder, do you think maybe that's part of it, or?
I wonder, because from what I understand about executive orders is we're not just making up laws here. Like, that's Congress's job. That is separation of powers. But it is talking about how laws are applied, because that's the whole point of the executive branch and the bureaucracy. And I would be really interested. So now I have like another thing on my brain to research tomorrow is what were some reversals? So I know a couple of them, but then what were some that are not reversals and that are totally new, and just kind of seeing the difference in them, because we have an understanding that politics, parties believe very different things and have different things they really want to focus on. And as it relates to the State of the Union, you say that. And I just thought, first of all, that how the State of the Union has like become something that like Thomas Jefferson just sent a letter to Congress and was like, there you go. And now it's this big thing. But when the president is standing there, he will have two females behind him. For the first time ever. And that's very interesting to think about. And it makes me wonder how that shapes what he's going to say.
That's an interesting
question. Because, it is a very historical thing. And then I wonder who's going to show up, because that was always like, when you're a teacher, like which Supreme Court justices are going to come and, that stuff. But I think that it is definitely a signal to also, when he's giving his State of the Union, here's what we've already done. Right. Because I think we live in a world now where people want action immediately.
Right. And I think this applies to every executive. Again, this is not just 100%. Now. This is just, we're talking about like what has to happen versus what has occurred. And you're exactly right. Again, fundamentally, if we're getting back to that, the executive literally gets stuff done. And so like the idea of how to express how we're going to go about, and maybe in some ways we're trying to accomplish the same things, no matter what executive it is, but the how we're going to go about it, how we're going to mobilize. I mean, it really is essentially a human being who got a new job with a staff and is in the middle of projects that are already happening. And
Yes.
so and now has to let us all know what the plans are in order to get these things done. I mean, fundamentally, that's what we're looking at. And so I like that that's part of this show, because I think it's showing that this is an ongoing dialogue. I don't have the answers for what's going to happen in the State of the Union. I've no prior knowledge to what's going to go. We could speculate. We know as teachers that it's going to be something. I would always assign it. I would always encourage students to see it because I think that there could definitely be a lot there. But it's an ongoing dialogue, I think that's important. One more thing that's ongoing, that's unusual, I was going to say is we do have, as of the recording of this, impeachment movement on impeachment for a former president is going on. And this is the first time it's ever happened to a non-sitting president.
Now, it's such an interesting thing because, this is circulating a lot of questions, and a lot of the answers are, I don't know, this hasn't happened to a president. I know that people have, judges have been impeached and not only removed from office, but barred from holding office. I mean, there is so much in the next couple of weeks because, so as of this recording, my understanding is that the majority leader and the minority leader have agreed to start the trial the week of February 8th. But it's a really interesting thing to understand because usually impeachment, the whole point is to remove somebody from office. But what does that look like when the person's no longer in office?
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting thing to live through because, I mean, I've done a whole lot of research on judges that have been impeached. I even looked back at the Andrew Johnson impeachment, and there were a lot of questions that I was like, I have no idea. I looked at Senate rules, but there's just not really a precedent for this.
Right.
And that's what's going to be interesting to understand as we go through this. And again, this is something that's going to develop over the next couple of weeks.
Right. Absolutely. Again, yes. At the time of this is live. So obviously at the time of this happening, this is still very future looking stuff. But again, I think from what the educator mindset is even if you see something coming on the horizon, there's preparations maybe for teaching of it. So I think that leads maybe to our next segment, which is a question we have, and our theme of the day, which is about, how do we utilize materials? How do we go beyond them? How do we collect them? Textbooks are definitely one answer, but materials, I think, means something very new and different. So if we can, we're going to pivot. And again, we welcome questions about this pivot, but the question is going to be about what works. I'm talking about materials, right? What is it? What do you search for? Maybe you're preparing for some new history. Even if you're looking at older history, what are your guiding principles to selecting materials? I have my opinions, but I'm going to ask you yours first.
Oh, darn it. I was like, well, you can start. I think that, when we've talked about this, Gary, we have two very different backgrounds in education and just in teaching. And as a first and second and third year teacher back in the early 2000s, again, we're dating ourselves, but the textbooks that we used were from when I was in 8th grade. The nice thing was that there was a guide. There was something to go along because I had done my student teaching in kindergarten. I happened to get a job as a social studies teacher because I liked social studies. And so I taken all those credits in college. It was nice to have a guide and kind of this, here's where I can start and here's where my students can start. And then as I, grew and as I became a professional, I started to know hey, I noticed that this chapter doesn't necessarily have everything I want. And starting to kind of collect and curate more materials as I went on. And as, to be honest, as technology went on, because when we started teaching, internet and computers weren't that big of a deal. And then now students are one-to-one. So even the evolution of what materials are, I think is a really cool thing. And then that's That's my experience. What about you?
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly right. You know, when I started teaching in what I call teacher school, I remember being told immediately that because time passes, you have to be aware of your own approaches from your own experience. And my experience was pretty pre-internet. Again, not to date myself, but like I remember someone describing what email was to me as a concept, you know, and things like this. So the textbook really was a really nice foundation. And I think what worked, you know, what works for me was early on just having that skeleton. I was looking at the very first text that I had when I started teaching. And in a section of it was sort of a nice map of like, think about these questions over the course of your year to ask. And I mean, I needed that. I needed that structure that's in here. I mean, beyond that, it did have sample lessons and things like that. And that was great. I would also admit that having the structure, even if it's a collection of sources, of primary sources, is really good. We used that when I was in high school, and then we still do. I see Reflective Educator. I just got a ping that Reflective Educator says, I search for primary sources and use them first and foremost. So that, I mean, having even a nice structure over time of primary sources, it's something to root it in. And that really does work. But yeah, I mean, if we're talking about biases, I needed, when I started teaching chapters, I needed students to see where we were going. Over time, absolutely. Grew to supplement things like this. You know, if we're talking about our own teaching history, when I started teaching, this is a true story, I had every single day 6 preps, 6 different classes, completely different classes, and a textbook for only one of them. So scrambling every day to create materials for 6 classes for 180 days, I mean, I appreciated when there was some kind of structure to it. And a lot of thought goes into it. A lot of thought goes into the guiding questions that arise. Reflective questions, that's an interesting one, like what works. Sometimes really good big questions, if they're essay questions at the end of a section, those could be extremely helpful. So that was nice. I do agree that with the internet, you can curate more. And I think that's amazing, right? It was not available. It wasn't even like I wasn't good at it. Like there were just not that many sites. I mean, very early on, you know, some companies were trying to organize it, but it was luck of the draw when I started teaching in 2000, you know. So, and I know that seems real late, but it's just what I had access to.
Yep.
I think also what students have access to. You know, we found out this year that, you know, being able to print out things if you need to, being able to have materials, sometimes is tough for kids.
And it's interesting, you know, we talk about primary sources, and I mean, even now with internet, there's so many videos available to help kids, because I mean, we've talked about this before. There are some primary sources that we don't even speak that kind of language anymore. And so they can be harder for kids, but there's so many other things out there that can help, you know, bring those to life. And that, to me, I think is the best thing about materials, and the best thing about living in the age that we do, is we have this ability, also understanding that there are hurdles. Not every student has reliable internet. Not every student has a printer. And how do we teach all of this stuff in a pandemic while keeping those kinds of things in mind is really difficult.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when tasked, there's definitely benefit to curating. And I do appreciate that. I guess, and again, I'm leaning on the like what works in terms of having materials that kind of exist outside of what you've collected is a trust factor. Because back to that, I'm going to use the word humility for myself. There's a lot of trust, and again, I think the teachers out there are much more on top of their game than I was when I started. I want to apologize to my first years for just the haphazard way sometimes I did things, but like questioning my own what I selected, my own biases, my own how I was presenting which materials and which other ones. Sometimes it's nice when some external, either individual or organization or anything like that, kind of, curates is a strong word, but just sort of like goes through that selection and presentation for me. I know it sounds terrible, but having pre-existing materials is really, really nice.
Well, especially like you said, if you're teaching 6 preps, like that is, first of all, that's crazy. But
Mhm.
even like, I mean, when I taught 2 preps, that was still a lot for me to do and to have those, that kind of a baseline set for me was really, really helpful.
Mhm.
And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, I just noticed again. Sometimes we get pings of chats. I see reflective educator says, I think that's the problem though. We not teach those students those words and the meaning of the words during the time. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. There's the context.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough. I'm realizing now. This is the thing about live videos right now, because my mind is going in two directions. There's the usual years and what I learned from that, and then there's the what it's like in this particular context, and how you do things differently. And I mean, it is rough. It is rough changing the fundamental way of doing things and having to accommodate. I mean, to backtrack and say, like, in a year where we did have classrooms, in kind of a standard way of everybody coming in that way, yeah, selecting your opportunities and working on even how to work through materials is its own level of skill that goes beyond just having the materials there. I mean, but I think that honors the art of teaching to me in terms of like, it's not just giving students materials and here, have at it, kind of thing. There's the art and skill that comes with that. I mean, my own students used to, this also dates me, used to joke about like how they wish that the matrix was real so they could just upload everything and graduate. And it's like, but you're missing out on the point of like the process of learning.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? There's no perfect materials that if you just memorize the book, you understand like, that's not how that works.
Well, and I think for me, and I'm glad that this was brought up because I remember teaching, I think it was Brutus 1, which all the AP Gov teachers are like, I mean, it's a piece. But finally just putting it under the document camera and going through it with them and being like, I have no idea what this word means. Like, let's look it up, or showing them the process of how I annotate, which again, that's what works for me. Everybody has kind of their own thing. Even reading the materials and also understanding that sometimes we choose materials that are not like a reading level for our kids. Like a lot of the founding documents, that's a high reading level. So how do we take excerpts of it while still maintaining the integrity of the entire document? That's a whole art within itself, for sure.
Yeah, that's absolutely a skill. Maybe it's good then to kind of transition into another piece. And, we're talking a lot about materials. Maybe let's take a look. I think it's time to take a look at some materials and maybe use that as a basis for the discussion we're happening. So once again, if it's all right with you, I think it's time to dive in. This is the part where we dive into the, some materials or some things we're talking about, text or whatnot. And I think, if we're going to go back to the experience of presenting things to students, recent history, which is something we talked about last time, and I'm sure we're going to keep talking about, is a big part of it. When I had a textbook, finally, when I started teaching, most late 20th century stuff was very, it was difficult to have as in-depth materials on, even though there were great materials, right? The thing about recent history is you have more videos, audio, recent stuff like this. But when it came to having solid text materials and things, often those last chapters were, quite something else. I mean, I'm sure people who watch the show will get tired of me talking about it, but, I mentioned I started teaching in 2000. 9/11 as an event, like living through that in the history class with students in New York, and then later on having students have it in a textbook was a very surreal experience because you kind of see how things you're living through are part of it. So an example, I think that we should toss out something that we both, again, I'm just gonna, at least I can say I lived through it. I don't know, is the Challenger.
Yes.
So
I'm going to share my screen because
right.
When we talk about curating things, I know that in my state, we had like a 10-year period where our standards never changed. So our, for 8th grade at the time when I taught it, it ended quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I'm like, this is the stuff I like because I lived through this. Like I remember these things. Right. And so this is something on our research page and it'll be linked in the show notes. But one of the things I think that both Gary and I wanted to talk about is the Challenger disaster. Mm-hmm. And being able to first just pull it out. I personally like our stuff, obviously, because I work here, but I also used it for years as an educator.
Yeah.
But the ability to take something like this and go through and say, I really want to spend more time on the space shuttle disaster. And this will date me. I was in kindergarten. I very much remember this event because I don't necessarily remember it happening, but I remember the reactions of the people around me. Mm-hmm. So this would be a thing I would probably give students beforehand, just to be like, I just want you to have some background on this, reading this, coming with questions that you might have. There's some awesome, pictures in here. And too, as teachers, and again, this stuff's all free on our website. Like there's no fee for this, but then there's review questions. So kids can come in or on your Zoom or, however this works with a basic understanding, and then you can dive into a document. And so for me, that document is the Challenger address, because not only does it hit the mark of, talk again, Arizona state standards here, talking about Ronald Reagan, but it's also presidential communication, what happens when something bad happens in our country, how does the president respond? And this, to me, I always like talking about it in class, whether I taught 8th graders or AP government or AP US history. I think I talked about it every single year, just in different ways, but I remember this because I remember watching it. And again, couldn't tell you what he said because I was 6, but I remember I felt better.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, first of all, I like our materials too. And the reason being, it fulfills what we were just talking about in terms of like what you're looking for in materials. Because it's not just a paragraph in a chapter, right? There's actually different materials for this same thing. So you can approach it from the point of view of that speech. You can approach it from the background essay. It goes into some of the scientific technical parts of it that are, nice to kind of cross reference, the order in which you do it. But I think most importantly, I think what you were just saying, that you can zoom in and zoom out of why you're talking about it. You can talk about it in terms of when something big happens, and something big happens frequently, how, for example, how anybody conveys that through communications is one, or how the executive is tied to it, or how people are tied to it, or, lots of different ways. That's just the address. There's also, that event happening is, placing it in, is it part of the latter days of the Cold War? Is it, it kind of is, right? Not only that it's the 80s, but also that it's, the space race itself is this big context to place it in. Is this still part of it? Is this purely something on its own? This particular event being, you mentioned your personal experience. We did watch it. We were one of the classrooms. I'm a little bit older. I was in 5th grade at the time. And it was a huge deal, advertised that a teacher was going to be there. And we had it on TV on that little cart with our, our tube. This was not digital TV at that point, but, wheeled it in, and we were going to watch it anyway. And then it became that one image that's in the materials here of the smoke and the booster rockets. That was indelible on that day, over and over again. And then there's even conversation about how general reporting happened. Yeah, that one there. That is seared into my brain even as an elementary school student. I'm sure anybody who is around then. But then it goes into how do you convey that, right, to students? Certainly at the time, maybe it was because I was young, we gain a lot more information now than we did on that day, which is an ongoing part of it. But enough time has passed now. It's been enough decades. We're looking back on it. This isn't a historical event that was really human policy caused, right? I mean, this is something, sometimes things happen that are outside the choices necessarily of human beings, but that are still an important part of our history and still things that, you know, in this case, the executive or people in general have to speak to.
Yeah. And I remember being a teacher when the Sandy Hook shooting happened, and having that conversation with kids, like, I mean, this is really scary, but this isn't the first time something has happened in America. And like, you know, there's this, and looking at how President Obama, you know, talked about it, and just talking about that, there is a part of being president that is not in the Constitution. And it's this, it is something has happened to fellow Americans. I have to say something, because everybody is looking toward that person in charge. And that's the nice thing about materials is, you know, and especially history, because the hardest thing about a textbook is it's a textbook and it doesn't move, but history moves, and history, you know, you start to learn new things, or new things happen, and it's just this big story, and it's not linear. And I think that's sometimes the hard thing about textbooks and materials is that we're history teachers. Like, to teach the history of America would take years and years and years and years. But how do you then take that all, put it into class periods of a year or however long, you know, your state does it? So
no, you're exactly right. You've made me think of something we had not discussed, which is, you know, you can work really hard to say, I now have this really nice linear series that I've created and put together that's sort of comprehensive, but it's going to get interrupted by the fact that the bell rings and you have to now think of them as segments. No matter how linear you are, you know, there are weekends, they have to get to another class, you know, kind of thing. And just sort of like, I might have put together the most beautifully curated logical sequence of things that captures, but it's going to get interrupted. And so how do I break it down so each day hits something in a concrete way? But then there's also, you know, something I faced, and I imagine you did too, and I imagine all teachers out there face, which is the opportunity cost. The time you spend on one thing is time you cannot spend on something else. And I know that's an ongoing problem. And so, you know, you mentioned things having happened before, you know, that's true for a lot. I mean, not always, you know, we mentioned at the beginning, there are sometimes brand new things that happen, but, you know, I think I certainly have seen the challenger problem, the challenger explosion. I hate to use the word, go from the biggest thing on anyone's mind to an example of something. Especially when, you know, in that very same essay, you know, since we're diving into those materials, you know, Columbia was years later. I mean, that was another huge event when you were a kid. You know, the Columbia was the first one to go up. This was a new dawn of technology, and then it was tragic to watch that happen. You know, it was 2003, I think. You know that. The re-entry and the death of 7 astronauts and the destruction of his thing but then something else occurs that's terrible, and you know becomes it's overwhelming, because these are real things happening to real people, and it's, you know, no longer something in just materials or in an essay or anything like this.
Well, and I think the nice thing about when we talk about primary sources, and I was really lucky, all the schools I taught at, our English teachers rocked, and they would talk about them, and they, like, you know, would do a rhetorical analysis on Reagan's speech, and then kids could come into my class and we could talk about the history, and this became this amazing thing. And it didn't happen all the time, because we all have our curriculum that we have to cover, especially as AP teachers, we have a test, but it can just become this thing that's bigger than your classroom and bigger than you. And that's what I love about history. Like, it's not just learning in my class and there's nothing else.
That's true. That's not the only exposure you have to the world. I know. I always felt a little guilty sometimes where it's like, I was teaching history, it's like, I get to teach everything that's happening that you would be seeing. And I'm sure no matter what you teach, you feel that way. So nothing against, you know, I had a science teacher friend who was like, everything is science. And I was like, I don't know. I think everything's social studies. But I realized that that's just the perspective that I have. You're bringing in the English teachers and others leads me to, I think, a really nice another transition to what today's topic was supposed to be about. At first, we talked about, what works, but there's also the need to go beyond. How do we go beyond the materials that we have? And those materials could be a textbook. And you mentioned, one way, which is, bringing in other opportunities for taking a look from different perspectives from different classes. But I think that's an important thing to consider is how do you go beyond what's presented to you? There's nice freedom there, but I think there's also some, I don't want to say dangers, but, there's extra work that goes into it of, again, how do I know how I'm going beyond is the best way to do it? What are other ways to go beyond?
I think that this is, again, I had a really unique experience as a teacher because I taught English for 3 years at the middle school level. And, I got to have all these really cool professional development. And I think the thing for me is I finally got to a point, especially when my AP government textbook just no longer did what I needed it to. Like government's happening every day. There are better examples out there. Or there's things like an impeachment happening.
Right.
But he's not president anymore. So like for me, it was the skills. It was learning that, it's kind of like, again, I'm bringing up the impeachment again, but I had a lot of questions that don't have answers because there's no history to it. But because I know that the, Senate makes the rules, I went on the Senate's, Senate.gov and started looking. And I think that fourth quarter last year, I was a teacher, we're trying to keep kids engaged. We're trying to hold the weight of the world. Like that was hard. I was a teacher for 17 years. That was by far the hardest quarter ever. And I remember the end project. I finally just asked kids, like, we can't do a moot court. I mean, we could, but I don't know that I have the time and the energy to create this. And I don't even know if you're all going to show up because I also have a child learning from home and my husband is teaching from home and giving them choice. So one of the big things they had said was, in the civil rights movement, our unit is so small. We want to know more about these things. And so I curated a list for them of like, here's where to start maybe. And I know here's where to start because again, I have done research. This is just stuff that like over 17 years I have. And they started to find stuff and say like, hey, have you heard about this podcast or have you listened to this? And the authentic learning comes and you're helping them with materials and you're helping them with stuff. But when you start to ask, or when they start to ask questions, or even as a teacher, you ask a question, if you ask that right question, light bulbs go off. And that's, to me, that is the fun thing about teaching. And that's something a textbook can't give you, if that makes sense, because there are just so many examples. Because if we're being honest, the President Trump's first impeachment, I just wrote on the board where we were at because I was like, we have other things that we need to learn. So we're going to put like in the process where it's at because it's an impeachment. So it's part of our curriculum, but I can't spend all this time on it. But then kids would know like, oh, the trial's going to the Senate. I wonder this, and this, but they knew where kind of to look. Right. If that makes it. Because especially in an age of the internet, materials are being developed all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even overwhelming.
Yeah, it is overwhelming. But again, I think, mentioning the internet, I think is perfect. And you're asking if it makes sense. It makes total sense that I realize I'm now countering what I said in the earlier section, which is I was really touting for myself the power of linearness, right? And I'm now realizing that's a bias I know I have toward thinking a certain way, particularly even in history, right? That there's this linear process. And I think the beauty of students growing up in the digital world is everything you can think in terms of branches. And like you said, there was nothing better in a class of, I often had 40, I don't know how many I had in classes, almost every day there was somebody who was going to be sparked by something to go with it. And the more freedom that they guided, the question was about how do you go beyond, they often guided that. They often had these branches to say, I want to know more about this approach. And as long as you're kind of getting to everything in all those branches, it really worked out. And they felt like I remember them expressing that they were surprised that we still got to everything, even though it wasn't linear. Because if you make sure that you follow those branches, they'd be like, how could you possibly, and I would show them the lesson plan and be like, how did you know that we were going to go in that direction? And it's like, well, you're going to go in X number of directions and we can ride that. It's the beauty of having dialogue in class. It's not making students think a certain way, but it's following them along their own journeys. And I mentioned the internet because when you showed us that earlier, materials in the Challenger, the idea of hyperlinks, the idea that you can read it straight through, or you can say halfway, oh, here's a phrase or an idea or a new thing that leads me somewhere else, and I can come back to where I am. And just thinking of history in those terms, as the tributaries of history, I think inspired by where the students want to go, there's that buy-in no matter what context you're in. So I think that's great.
Well, and the best part, teachers, by the way, when kids ask you a question and you don't know, you can just say, I don't know. Somebody want to figure that out for me? Those are my favorite words to say in a classroom. I'm not Google. I don't know everything, but I'd love to learn.
Yeah.
And I mean, I always had our objective on the board. Like, here's in the next 10 days, this is the big thing we got to get to.
Right.
Here's all the little stuff that goes under it. And I mean, I got to a point where I would check things off, but it was always interesting when we'd go off topic, how I would answer some of those questions. And It's like, this wasn't even planned, but it was so student driven that we kind of checked off a couple boxes, and I feel pretty good about it because they probably got it better than they would have with the original plan I had.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes from being comfortable with the skills of studying, because it's not just, I don't know, that's it. I mean, it's, I don't know, let's find out together. How do we do that? And there's lots of different ways. I mean, historians, that's again, the beauty of recent or even far past, is you can take completely different routes and different views and looks on these things. And there's no end to the curiosity to say, well, what about thinking from this perspective? Or what about, just posing it differently, and let's do that together. And the students see, like, yeah, it may not be as predictable, and yet we still got to the skills that we were trying to get to of studying history. So
yeah,
I think that's amazing. Going beyond, I'm sure that's not the end of this conversation. I'm sure we'll talk about this even more, but we're coming up to our last segment, which is part, again, we like our mail part. For those either watching now or watching in the past, you can, even if you watch this later on, still get in touch with us. We do take a look at our Twitter page. To get in touch with us directly, if you have a question for us or something you want us to bring up in future episodes, real easy. If you have a Twitter account, hashtag BRI Teacher Time, hashtag BRI Teacher Time. In whatever you post, if you tag us at BRI Institute on Twitter. There's also other ways to get us through email and any other way you'd contact us, but that's something we're monitoring. I'd like to read something from our mailbag, if it's okay, Liz.
Sure thing.
This comes from a Joshua S. Who asks, it is a question. I have to first make sure it's a question. Joshua says, different states have different standards for what to teach in history, sometimes because of divergent political ideologies. How can we be sure that our students' textbooks are providing a comprehensive and balanced viewpoint? So this fits in really nicely for what we're going to talk about. I got a feeling that they saw the big question that we had posed last time, and we're going to talk about our big question at the end of here. But back to Joshua's question, said once again, how can we be sure that our students' textbooks, we can even say materials, are providing a comprehensive and balanced viewpoint?
Oof. I think that first and foremost, understanding how the materials get chosen. Because I know, again, state of Arizona might be different than Virginia. Here, it's the school districts, and there's like a whole process, like teachers vet textbooks and the community has input. There is a huge, huge process that involves a lot of different people. So, I mean, first and foremost, I would say just knowing what that process is and when the last time it happened. Because sometimes, especially for social studies, those textbooks are old. Right.
Sure, that just happens. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that. Yeah, you mentioned Virginia because that's where I taught and where I am right now. Yeah, I mean, there came a point in my district, at least, where they just didn't purchase new ones. That's what
Yep.
happens, right? So I mean, it makes sense, right? It's a resource, and there were committees and individuals who definitely had to decide on that. But I think no matter where you are, we're definitely getting into a world of more curated materials, right? And which is why I moved on from even saying textbooks to just materials in general, and say, I think part of it is that seeking out materials that provide that is tough. We have, I mean, if we're going to put a, mention, we might as well. We do have a resource that's a really interesting resource based on what we're talking about, called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, that does have chapters. It does have that sort of, what I really like, that nice foundation of chapters. It has questions in it. It has all those parts that are really nice, but it's not necessarily a textbook, because it is entirely digital, also, by the way, entirely free, but has that other approach. It has, I would argue, we talked about it last time, point counterpoints in it. That's an interesting way of looking at.
It's my favorite.
Yeah, I mean, why do you like it so much? I'm intrigued.
Because it gives you two sides, and it shows students argumentation, not arguing, but argumentation. So you have two scholars. So I think the one we talked about last time was the election of 1800, a political revolution. Dr. Bailey and Dr. Estes, who I've learned from both of them, it's a cool thing for kids to see, and for teachers. Like, I just liked reading them for myself, because I was like, man, I thought this way, but now I have some more information. It gives students the agency to learn themselves and not be told, yes, it was a political revolution, or no, it wasn't. It was, here are two very well, known scholars. Here's what they have to say. We all might come up with different answers on this, and that's okay, because if there was an answer, I mean, we wouldn't be studying it. And that's the nice thing about history, is there's just not always an answer. But yeah, that, I love the point counterpoints, because I mean, I taught AP government, and trying to teach students how to write an argumentative essay, or just how to have a Socratic discussion where you're being, that is what you're talking about. And it's not opinions, and you're not yelling at each other. It's, here's a piece of evidence I have that counters what you said or supports what you said. So that is, I love Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness. Obviously.
Yeah. No, and I agree. I love the phrasing that you just had too, which is to make an argument. And again, I was a philosophy teacher as one of the 6 preps. that word I have mentioned in many shows, if you ever watch me on our YouTube channels, about the word argument, I feel like it's taken on such an odd meaning to put forth premises and support them, versus, like you said, argumentation. The point counterpoint is not like one person said, no, you're wrong, here's why. They're not like point by point, but rather, I, as a historian, am presenting and looking at this in one way. A different historian is looking at it in a sometimes very different way. And I think it brings in, because this is back to Joshua's question about providing comprehensive and balanced viewpoints. It invites students to say, here's maybe a third way, that it's not one way that here's the text and I have to memorize this, which is, again, I think one way of thinking, nor is it, here's a debate, one of them's right, one of them is totally wrong, and which is very divisive, but rather say, you have a way of looking at this that is very justified. You have a way of looking at this. Do I have a way of looking at this that's justified? And I think that's a really inviting way to have students take a look at comprehensive viewpoint. Having their own viewpoint based on something, I think, addresses what Joshua is trying to get to.
And it also allows students to say, here's what I think, and then here's why I don't think this. It's not just, yes, it was a political revolution. It was, well, based on my studies, which, again, we know that studies are, I mean, hopefully forever. I'm a lifelong learner. Right now, with the information I have, here's what I believe, and here's why I disagree with, parts of the other essay. It creates, again, critical thinkers, so that hopefully in some way, shape, or form, this civil discourse spills out of our classrooms and spills out into society, where people can say, I disagree with you. Here's why I disagree with you, and here's why I think that what I think, but I still understand where you're coming from. I just don't agree with you.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's a great point, that it's based on something to say, here's why I've not only do I have these materials, but I've looked at them, I've thought about them, and these conclusions I've come to. And I think in those ways, students like ourselves can utilize and go beyond the materials that they have in really meaningful ways. See, we came full circle there.
You're so good at this.
No, we are. It's our back and forth. That's good. But we are running out of time. So I do encourage everyone who is either watching now live or watching this having happened in the past. Very exciting living through it. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. I did want to mention to say just thank you for tuning in, whether it was live or recorded. If you did like this video, make sure you subscribe to our channel. That's the best way to watch it. And come back February 9th will be our next one. So I'm sure quite a lot will happen between now and February 9th. In that one, the topic of that one is looking at the past through clear colored glasses, question mark, as opposed to rose colored glasses. You know, how do you look at the past in a way that you know, shaded, I guess, you know, in terms of amazing, horrible, you know, all these other things. Anyway, so we're going to put out new episodes every other Tuesday. Our YouTube channel in general releases new videos twice a week on all things in U.S. history, including close reads of primary sources, interviews with distinguished scholars that, as you mentioned, from around the country, homework help videos for students who are really nice produced videos for that. To follow us for any of these things, you can check us out on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram for updates on programs or events that we do and ways to get involved. But most of all, of course, again, the purpose of this is we love to hear from you. So you can comment on your thoughts on the video below or get in touch with us through social media. And remember that hashtag is hashtag BRI Teacher Time. So until next time, we'll be watching what's going on, thinking about things that are happening and how they go in the classroom. And you and I will talk, but we'll see each other again for our next show on February 9th.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks.